What if I told you that the greatest comeback story in sports history was also one of the greatest lies ever told? And what if I told you that understanding that lie, really sitting with it, might actually teach you more about human performance, human psychology, and human redemption than almost anything else you've ever heard? That's what today is about. I'm Peter Attia, and welcome to The Drive. I want to start by asking you to do something that might feel uncomfortable. I want you to set aside, just for a moment, everything you think you know about Lance Armstrong. Set aside the anger, if you have it. Set aside the admiration, if that's still there. Set aside the narrative that ESPN or the New York Times or the documentary filmmakers handed you. Because I think when you hold all of that so tightly, you actually miss something really important. You miss the full human being. And in medicine, in performance science, in psychology, missing the full human being is how we get things catastrophically wrong. So let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the doping scandal. Not the beginning of the USADA investigation. The actual beginning. A boy growing up in Plano, Texas, raised by a single mother, Linda, who had him when she was 17 years old. Lance was, from an early age, extraordinarily gifted physically. His VO2 max, which is the maximum rate at which your body can consume oxygen during exercise, would eventually be measured at around 85 milliliters per kilogram per minute. To give you context, elite cyclists often sit in the low to mid-70s. Recreational athletes might be in the 40s. Lance was operating at a physiological ceiling that most humans will never approach, no matter how hard they train. But here's what I find fascinating from a scientific standpoint. VO2 max alone does not make a champion. I want to be really clear about that because there's a persistent myth that elite performance is just about raw aerobic capacity. It's not. What Lance had, in addition to this exceptional oxygen uptake, was an unusually high lactate threshold, meaning he could sustain an extremely high percentage of his VO2 max for a very long time before his muscles started producing lactate at a rate that would force him to slow down. And his muscle fiber composition, his pedaling efficiency, the biomechanics of how he transferred power through the bike. All of these things combined to create someone who was genuinely exceptional even before he ever touched a performance-enhancing drug. He was also psychologically wired in a way that I find both fascinating and, frankly, a little terrifying. The people who knew Lance before cancer, before the Tour de France wins, before the global fame, they describe a young man who was almost pathologically competitive. And I don't use the word pathological lightly. I mean that in the clinical sense. He had a need to win that went so far beyond the typical competitive drive that it seemed to operate outside of normal social constraints. He could not win. And when you're wired that way, and you also happen to be physiologically extraordinary, you get something that is both breathtaking and dangerous. He became a professional cyclist in the early 90s and quickly established himself as a one-day racer, a classics specialist. He won the World Championship road race in 1993 at just 21 years old. He was brash, he was cocky, he was American in a sport that was very European, and the Europeans mostly couldn't stand him. But he was good. He was very, very good. And then in October of 1996, Lance Armstrong was diagnosed with testicular cancer. Not just testicular cancer, metastatic testicular cancer that had spread to his lungs, his abdomen, and his brain. His oncologists initially gave him a relatively grim prognosis, though there is some debate about how explicitly that was communicated to him. What isn't debatable is that by any reasonable medical standard, Lance Armstrong should not have returned to professional cycling. He underwent aggressive chemotherapy, he had brain surgery, and in the span of less than 2 years, he came back and won the Tour de France. Now, I've talked to a lot of oncologists over the years about this case, and I want to share something that I think gets lost in the cultural narrative. The specific chemotherapy regimen Lance received, BAP, which is bleomycin, etoposide, and cisplatin, is actually one of the more effective regimens for testicular cancer. Testicular cancer, particularly the non-seminoma type that Lance had, is one of the cancers where we actually have very good chemotherapeutic outcomes. Lance's case was severe, make no mistake, but the cancer that he had is one of the more treatable metastatic cancers if you catch it and treat it aggressively. That doesn't diminish what he went through. The treatment alone is brutal. But I think it's important to understand that his survival, while remarkable, isn't entirely miraculous from a purely oncological standpoint. What is genuinely extraordinary is what his body looked like on the other side of that treatment. He came out lighter. He came out with a different power to weight ratio. Some researchers and coaches who worked with him have speculated that the chemotherapy essentially forced a physiological reset, stripping him of muscle mass in ways that actually made him a better climber. And climbing, as any cycling fan knows, is what wins the Tour de France. Whether this is fully accurate or somewhat mythologized, I honestly don't know with certainty, but the physiology is at least plausible. He came back to the Tour in 1999 and he won, and then he won again in 2000, and 2001, and 2002, and 2003, and 2005, 7 consecutive Tour de France victories, the greatest dynasty in the history of cycling. And along the way, he became not just a sports hero, but a global icon. Livestrong raised hundreds of millions of dollars for cancer research and support. He was on the cover of every magazine. He testified before Congress. He was friends with presidents and celebrities and world leaders. He was, in many people's minds, the greatest American athlete of all time, and it was all built on a lie. Or more precisely, it was built on something that was simultaneously real and fraudulent. And I think that complexity is exactly what makes this case so philosophically and psychologically interesting. Here's what I want to say about the doping, and I want to be careful here because I think most discussions of this topic are intellectually lazy. The easy narrative is, Lance cheated, therefore his wins don't count, therefore he was never really great, therefore he's just a fraud. But that narrative collapses under scrutiny. The doping that Lance engaged in, EPO, testosterone, blood transfusions, was pervasive throughout the Peloton during that era. Almost every significant rider from that period has either been implicated, suspended, or has admitted to some form of doping. The riders he was beating were also doping. So when people say his wins don't count, what they're really saying is that the entire era of professional cycling is a null set, which is a defensible position, but one that few people actually take to its logical conclusion. What Lance did that was different, and this is critical, is that he organized it. He professionalized it. He ran it with the same systematic precision that he brought to every other aspect of his performance. His team, the U.S. Postal Service team, and later the Discovery Channel team, had team doctors, had protocols, had a level of medical sophistication in their doping program that went beyond what other teams were doing. And then, when people started asking questions, when former teammates tried to speak up, when journalists started investigating, Lance did something that crossed a very clear moral and legal line. He lied, aggressively, repeatedly, publicly. He called former teammates liars. He used his considerable power and resources to intimidate people into silence. He sued journalists. He went on television and looked the entire world in the eye and said he had never doped, had never been offered drugs, had never taken drugs. That's not just cheating within a competition where everyone is cheating. That's a sustained, calculated campaign of deception. And when you understand the distinction, you start to understand why so many people who might otherwise have some sympathy for him find it so hard to extend that sympathy, because he had choices along the way. At any point, he could have come clean. And he chose again and again and again not to. I think about this from a psychological standpoint a lot. What does it take to maintain a lie of that scale at that level of public scrutiny for that many years? There's actually research on this. When people tell small lies, their amygdala, the part of the brain associated with emotional responses, including guilt and fear, shows activation. But studies have found that repeated lying is associated with diminishing amygdala response. You get habituated to the dishonesty. The emotional cost comes down over time. For someone like Lance, who was already wired to suppress vulnerability, to show nothing but strength and certainty, the neural machinery for sustained self-deception and other deception was probably exceptionally well developed. And then there's the story he told himself. I've spoken with people who have spent significant time with Lance, both before and after the confession, and what they describe is someone who genuinely convinced himself, at some level, that the doping was not the source of his wins, that the doping was just leveling a playing field that was already dirty, that the real reason he won was his physiology, his preparation, his suffering tolerance, his tactical brilliance, his will. And here's the thing, he wasn't entirely wrong. He was just entirely wrong about whether that justified the lying. In January of 2013, Lance sat down with Oprah Winfrey and finally admitted what so many had suspected and known for years. He doped. He admitted to EPO, cortisone, testosterone, blood transfusions. He admitted it had been systematic throughout his career. And in that moment, the mythology cracked open. The yellow wristbands came off in towns across America. The Livestrong brand, once one of the most recognized in the world, began its slow decline. And Lance Armstrong went from being one of the most celebrated human beings on the planet to one of the most reviled. I watched that interview. I've watched it multiple times since. And my reaction is complicated, which I think is the appropriate response, because I saw in that interview someone who was not fully cooked in terms of their reckoning with what they'd done. He was contrite in the way that someone is contrite when they've been caught. He used the language of accountability without fully demonstrating it. He still minimized in subtle ways. He still reached for justifications. He wasn't yet the man he has apparently become in the years since. Because here's what I think is actually the most interesting part of the Lance Armstrong story, and it's the part that gets the least attention: what happened after. How does a human being rebuild a life, an identity, a sense of self after a collapse of that magnitude? After you have been publicly exposed as not just a cheat, but a liar on a global scale? After you have lost hundreds of millions of dollars in sponsorships and legal settlements? After you have seen friendships dissolve and a marriage end, and your own children have to navigate what it means to have you as a father? What do you do with that? The psychological literature on what we might call redemption arcs or post-traumatic growth is actually quite rich. The concept of post-traumatic growth, developed by researchers Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, refers to positive psychological change that can emerge from struggling with highly challenging life circumstances. It's distinct from resilience, which is about bouncing back. Post-traumatic growth is about being fundamentally changed, and changed in ways that include a deeper appreciation for life, a greater sense of personal strength, new possibilities, relating to others in deeper ways, and spiritual or existential development. What I see in Lance in the years since the confession, at least in the conversations I've had with him and the things I've observed publicly, is something that looks genuinely like that. Not perfectly, and not without backsliding, because that's not how human growth works, but something real. There's a quality to his self-reflection now that wasn't there in 2013. He's talked about therapy. He's talked about the work of actually sitting with what he did, not the version of it that allows him to feel less bad, but the full weight of it, the people he hurt, the careers he derailed, the teammates he pressured, the journalists he went after, the trust of millions of cancer survivors who wore his bracelet and believed in him as someone who embodied the possibility of coming back from the worst thing that could happen to you. That is genuinely a lot to sit with, and I think one of the things I find most interesting about his evolution is how he talks about his identity now versus then. In his cycling years, Lance's identity was completely and totally fused with winning, not just with being a cyclist, with winning. He has said in interviews, including our conversation, that he didn't know who he was if he wasn't winning. And when you build your entire concept on an external outcome, especially an outcome that requires you to do increasingly compromised things to maintain, you are building on sand. And eventually, inevitably, the tide comes in. What I think about when I think about his case from a mental health and performance standpoint is how common this is in a less extreme form in high achievers across many domains. The athlete, the surgeon, the entrepreneur, the academic, who has so completely merged their sense of worth with their output that any threat to the output becomes an existential crisis. And when you're operating from that place of existential terror about losing your identity, you become capable of things you might otherwise never do, not because you're a bad person, but because the threat feels so fundamental that normal ethical guardrails start to feel like obstacles rather than guides. That's not an excuse, but it is an explanation. And explanations matter if we actually want to understand human behavior, which I think we should, because most people who do genuinely bad things are not simply bad people. They are people who, under a particular set of pressures and incentives and psychological vulnerabilities, made decisions that they would not have made in a different context. Understanding that is not soft. Understanding that is accurate. And accurate understanding is the only path to actually changing behavior, whether in ourselves or in the systems we design. Now let me bring this back to something more concrete, because I don't want to leave this as purely philosophical territory. I think there are lessons here that are genuinely applicable to anyone who cares about performance, health, and long-term well-being. The first lesson is about the relationship between identity and behavior. If you are so completely identified with a particular role or outcome that you cannot tolerate the version of yourself that fails, that doesn't perform, that comes up short, you are at serious psychological risk. Not risk of becoming Lance Armstrong, but risk of making decisions from a place of fear and desperation that you will later regret. The work of developing what psychologists call a more secure and less contingent sense of self-worth is not soft or self-indulgent. It is foundational to both ethical behavior and long-term performance. The second lesson is about the physiology of extreme performance and what we ask of human bodies in that pursuit. The era of cycling that Lance dominated was, without question, one of the most physically extreme sporting endeavors in human history. The Tour de France covers roughly 2,000 miles in 21 stages, many of them in extreme heat and at altitude. The metabolic demands are staggering. I've looked at the data. The power outputs required, the caloric expenditure, the recovery demands, these are genuinely at the edge of what human physiology can sustain. And when you push systems to their edges, you create the conditions in which shortcuts become tempting. I'm not saying that justifies anything. I'm saying that if we design sporting events that push athletes past the boundaries of clean human performance, we should not be surprised when athletes use whatever tools are available to meet those demands. The third lesson is about cancer and survivorship, and this one I feel very strongly about. Lance's cancer story, whatever you think of the rest of it, is real. He had a life-threatening illness. He went through extraordinarily difficult treatment. He came out the other side, and Livestrong, for all its complications, genuinely helped millions of people who were navigating cancer diagnoses feel less alone and more supported. That work has value that should not be entirely erased by the doping narrative. The people who wore those yellow wristbands because they were fighting for their own lives or for the lives of someone they loved were not wrong to draw comfort and inspiration from the idea that someone had faced something terrible and come back. They weren't wrong. They were just, in some ways, working with an incomplete picture. The fourth lesson, and this might be the most important one, is about the possibility and the process of genuine change. I am deeply skeptical of easy redemption narratives. Someone does something terrible, they get caught, they say they're sorry, they rebrand, and we're all supposed to feel good about it. That's not redemption. That's reputation management. But I'm equally skeptical of the position that people cannot fundamentally change, that someone who has done harm is forever and irrevocably defined by that harm. I've seen too much evidence to the contrary, both in the research and in real human lives, to believe that. What genuine change looks like is not comfortable. It doesn't look like a slick apology and a new podcast and a carefully managed public image. It looks like years of uncomfortable work. It looks like sitting with shame that is not quickly resolved. It looks like making amends in ways that are private and costly and that don't necessarily restore your reputation. It looks like a rebuilt sense of self that is not dependent on external validation. It looks like the ability to tell the true story of what you did without flinching away from the worst parts of it. And from what I can observe, Lance Armstrong is doing at least some of that work. Imperfectly, incompletely, but genuinely. I want to close with something that I've been thinking about more and more as I've gotten older and seen more of how human lives actually unfold. We have a tendency, especially in American culture, to want our stories clean. We want heroes who are purely heroic and villains who are purely villainous. And reality is just so much more complicated than that. The Lance Armstrong story is a story about extraordinary human capacity and extraordinary human failure, often in the same person, sometimes in the same moment. His physiology was real, his suffering was real, his cancer was real, his deception was real, his harm to others was real, and his growth, I believe, is also real. All of those things can be true simultaneously. That's not moral relativism. That's just an honest accounting of how complex human beings actually are. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we flatten people into either heroes or villains because we lose the actual lessons that are available to us when we look at the full picture. The full picture of Lance Armstrong is one of the most interesting, most instructive, most genuinely human stories in the history of sports. A kid from Texas with a body built for greatness and a psychology that could not tolerate anything less. A cancer diagnosis that should have ended everything and somehow opened something new. A dynasty built on exceptional talent and systematic fraud. A fall that was public and devastating on a scale few people ever experience. And then the long, slow, unglamorous work of figuring out who you are when you can no longer outrun the truth. That's the story. That's what I think is worth sitting with, and I hope you'll sit with it a little longer today, and maybe ask yourself what pieces of it, even the uncomfortable ones, speak to something you recognize in your own life. Because that's usually where the most useful reflection happens. Not in thinking about someone else's failures, but in noticing the places where we share, even in much smaller ways, some of the same vulnerabilities. Thanks for listening to The Drive. If this conversation resonated with you, please share it with someone who you think would benefit from it. And as always, if you're getting value from this podcast, the best thing you can do is leave a review and tell a friend. I'll see you next time.